Hello and welcome to the workshop. I hope you have your favourite drink and snacks on hand because this is going to be a bit of a long one and nerdy and there's no shooting. So before I show you the firearm, I'll just set the scene a bit. For those of you who are familiar with the Napoleonic era, certain countries, or let's say most countries, had a tradition of having jaeger troops. Most notably the British riflemen with the Baker, for example, but they got that from the Prussians. The Austro-Hungarian Empire also had this habit of sharpshooting corps. Even the Swiss cantons had them. One major player in the Napoleonic Wars did not, and that was France. Now, that's not to say they didn't know about them or appreciate them. There was even an official pattern of rifle in France, Carbine de Versailles. There was a long one and a short one. But basically, Napoleon didn't approve of them. Rather, he didn't think that there was any, it was worth investing in the training of riflemen because ultimately they didn't really make any difference. There's some argument to be made for that. La Grande Armée did well trampling all over Europe without any specific rifle corps. That would maybe be a discussion for another time. But this is all about to change because in the 1830s France decides to invade Algeria, and then they're engaged in warfare where people do not play by the same rules, and these mashed columns and lines are getting hit pretty badly by local tribesmen with, let's say, their own primitive smoothbore muskets, but they are still extremely good shots and they're firing from concealment. It's rocky landscape over there, and that meant that they had great difficulties in flushing them out. And there suddenly appears the benefits of well-trained, well-armed and accurate skirmishers. So about this time the French finally come round to designing, well, first creating a rifle corps, the Chasseurs à pied, and of course then a suitable firearm for them. And that's what we have today. We have the 1837 Chasser Carbine. And yes, according to the nomenclature of the time, this is a carbine. So to know more about the origins of this rifle, we have to go 10 years back. We are in 1827, and then the bright young Henri Gustave Delvigne invents his, well, what we now know as the Delvigne breech principle. If you want to know more about that, I heartily suggest you watch my vid on the French cavalry officer's pistol of 1833. It uses exactly the same principle, and you can get a good look at what it actually physically looks like. But in brief, what we have is an extended breech plug, which contains a smaller diameter powder chamber, which is supposed to contain the entire charge. And of course that forms a step between the powder chamber and the bore. And against this step is loaded the round ball, still at this stage. And what you do is that you would give the ball a hearty strike or two with your ramrod, which is usually heavier than the normal ramrod. This would of course cause the ball to squish down and expand into the rifling. So this is of course vastly faster than trying to hammer a patched ball down and until it sits on top of the powder. Now in 1828 the carbine was tested, not this one but the prototype rifle with the new breech system was tested and put up against a normal standard flintlock smoothbore rifle, smoothbore musket, and indeed the accuracy was better, particularly at its short distances. However, it lacked power and it lacked range. Now these two, the power and range, are kind of intrinsic to the system because you're limited to the amount of powder you can put in due to the volume of the powder chamber. If you put more powder in than the volume of the chamber, the bullet is going to end up sitting on a bunch of powder, and when you hammer it, it's just not going to expand. It's going to crush the powder and it's not going to expand into the rifling. So the only way you could increase the charge and still have the benefit of the Delvigne breech would be to have an enormously long breech plug, which is just silly. the major point about accuracy was being able to consistently deform the bullet, shot after shot. The problem is, of course, that the ramrod head is, of course, not precisely tolerant to the bore of the rifle. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be rubbing all the way down. So you couldn't ensure that the ball would be flattened exactly the same way. Because of that, of course, you get a shift in the center of gravity, and means once it leaves the bore, it's going to wobble off, and you will get a lack of accuracy. According to the reports that I've seen, or the anecdotes, this wasn't a problem at short range. I don't know what short range was defined as, but at long range, it didn't seem to produce any better accuracy than a well-prepared smoothbore. So despite these perhaps disappointing results, the system still showed promise, and the studies continued. And between 1831 and 1833, we have Colonel Marquis Dupont de Pontcharra, who was then director of the arsenal at Maubeuge, and then later Châtellerault, when Maubeuge was absorbed by Châtellerault. He studied the system and eventually came up with the idea of putting a wooden sabot between the ball and the mouth of the powder chamber. So note the sabot has a hemispherical recess in the middle of it, and the aim of that is to center the ball nicely, and then when you hammer it, you will hopefully get a far more regular or consistent expansion shot after shot into the rifling. So we are now in 1833, and all of a sudden the Minister of War has the burning need for a rifled carbine, no doubt brought about by the events in Algeria. So, regardless of the reasons, the arsenals at Châtellerault, Mutzig and Maubeuge proposed some prototypes. They're all based on the Delvigne system, so with the powder chamber. And perhaps of no great surprise, the model proposed by Dupont de Pontcharra at Maubeuge is decided the winner and is officially adopted in 1837. Now, it's immediately nicknamed by the media Carbine à Pontcharra. This, despite the fact that Delvigne actually did all the work and the R&D. He even complained publicly, but all this was brushed aside. Sort of plebeian there. And but thankfully he never gave up, and then we later have, of course, the Chamelot Delvigne revolver, so he didn't give up. Anyway, that's probably enough waffling for now. It's not over. Let's take a closer look at the features of this rifle. So let us start here at the stock. So this is a walnut stock, if you please, so only the best for these jaegers. And you'll note, if you can see, that the roundel here is marked MR for Manufacture Royale, because we are in the restoration period of the July monarchy. All the fittings are brass, and they are in fact identical to those of the dragoon rifle, or musket at the time. You can see there. Now you can see the curious shape of the Pontcharra percussion lock. Now this was a design genuinely created by Dupont de Pontcharra. So here is the inside of a Pontcharra lock. As you can see, it's very, very compact, and we have one single mainspring that powers everything. And now let's have a closer look at the Delvigne breech area, let's say. So we have the breech plug here. There's a clear transition between the plug and the barrel, and it's screwed into the barrel, so the shoulder or the step is probably around here. And then we have the nipple. We have this curious wall here, which leaves an annular space around the percussion nipple, and we have a little sight leaf with a first notch and opening for 200 meters, and then a top notch for 250 meters. Note here it is number 80, made in 1837, so this is one of the very earliest ones. So what is this random thing here for? Well, in fact, it is a leftover feature for something that was never adopted, and that is the Bruneil cartridge. And the idea, I've made a prototype here. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any drawings or descriptions of how it actually looked, but the idea was that the sabot would contain the percussion cap. Originally it would have been covered by a little waxed paper disc, or sort of tissue paper or something to stop it popping out, but the idea was before loading you just put cartridge over the nipple, and if it worked, down, whoop, the percussion cap would stay behind, and then you'd load the cartridge as normal. The idea isn't as ludicrous as it sounds. In fact, the motions for loading would be very similar to what troops would be used to doing with flintlock firearms. You prime the pan and then load. So this would be pretty much the same thing. So this annular recess here is to help guide the cartridge in. Now, the problem they found was that these cartridges were rather delicate, and you can imagine that if you're in a rush, you can push it down, then maybe you twist or you just bend and the cartridge would tear and basically disintegrate and be useless. Furthermore, these were rather complicated to manufacture, which was then a problem of time and expense at the munitions factories. So despite it not actually being used in service, they decided to keep this guide. Sometimes in literature they say this is expressly to help the shooter place a percussion cap on there, but no, it's actually more of a hindrance than anything, especially on the side here. You have to come in from the front and the top. But no, it was actually used, or intended to be used with this cartridge. Now the idea of having a cap integral with the cartridge didn't end here. I mean, as far as French service did, that's as far as it went. But the Austrians continued with their Kammerbüchse, with the Augustin lock, which uses a fulminant tube. Thank you to Balázs for this nice picture he sent of his ones. So you can see the fulminant tube is attached to the cartridge, so that would be loaded in, lock snapped shut, and the cartridge torn away. And the system very close to this cartridge was used in the Podewils Lindner capping breech loader. So that also has a cap, just like this, just pushed in the back, which you would pop onto the nipple, open the breech, load the cartridge, and off you go. So yeah, it's a curious little side note in the development of paper cartridges for percussion rifles. Anyway, moving on, nothing much to see on the rest. The barrel itself has, well, if I say first, the charge in the Delvigne breech is 4 grams of powder, and the barrel itself has a 6-groove rifling, rounded rifling, and it has a twist rate of 1 in just over 6 meters, so very slow, intended of course for round ball. And you can see here the head of the ramrod, which is quite substantial. The idea was that you would probably just use 1, maybe 2 sharp taps with a ramrod to set up the bullet in there. And you can see here that there's a bayonet lug here, which brings us to the next peculiar feature of this carbine, and that is the bayonet itself. Now, as you can see, it is a saber bayonet, or actually they called it bayonet saber, and this could be mounted directly on the barrel, or it could be fitted with a handle to be used as it's a short sword, but it's more of a camp tool, if you like. The idea was that they could indeed get rid of the normal short sword for fieldcraft and camp use, and they would have one multi-tool effectively. Now, as all of these types of multi-tools, it was neither one nor the other, and the idea never went any further than that. So this is really a bayonet that's unique to this carbine, and they are extremely rare and extremely expensive. So now we know the ins and outs of the carbine itself. Well, what about the famous chasseurs à pied who were supposed to use it? Well, we know the carbine itself is developed from 1833 onwards. It's a bit different for the troops. We have to wait until the royal decree of the 14th of November 1838 for the creation of the first experimental units of these chasseurs, and they would be commanded by the Duke of Orléans. These units would be composed of existing soldiers who already had proved their exceptional accuracy. So they were not trained up to be chasseurs. This was a unit that was supposed to be ready to go to see how they would perform. 1 year later is the official decree, 16th of September 1839. There is then the formation of the first official battalion of the Chasseurs à pied. And they were then stationed at Vincennes. So if you wish to research more about this regiment at the time, they're either known as Chasseurs de Vincennes or Chasseurs d'Orléans. So these chasseurs with their swanky uniforms very quickly established their reputation in Algeria and elsewhere in North Africa. Unfortunately, this carbine was not very well liked. There was a couple of problems with it in use. Yes, of course, it was far more accurate than the service rifle, so it fulfilled its role, but it was still plagued by this lack of power and range, simply because we're bound by this 4 grams of powder in the chamber, and that's really not very much in terms of a service load. Secondly, it was noted that the ball had a tendency to jump the rifling, to strip when fired, which apparently produced extremely unpleasant recoil. I'll see. And the last problem was the wooden sabot. So it was critical to the accuracy, but they had a tendency to split when loading, which resulted in you showering your mates with burning splinters when you fired. This was, of course, the era where you would still tendency to have rows of soldiers firing over people's shoulders. So that must have been quite unpleasant. So unfortunately, the service life of this carbine is relatively short. It's replaced temporarily by the 1838 wall gun, which is essentially the same kind of firearm, also with a Delvigne breech, just massive, and it has a caliber of 20 millimeters. And then there comes a long line of dedicated Chasser carbines, which ends with the 1858 pattern, sorry, 1859 pattern, which is this lovely rifle here, which is actually the last percussion firearm of the French, developed from the ground up. So it's quite interesting that the Chasseurs benefited from all the evolutions of accurizing the percussion rifle. So they started with a Delvigne breech, they finish with the Minier rifle, and in between they also have the Touvenin tige system. So lucky boys. So here we are at the end of this episode, concentrating on the history of this carbine, which is, by the way, extremely rare. There's only about 2,500 ever produced. And there will be another episode which will be about shooting. Now, I still need to do some more research because I want to be absolutely sure of the components of the cartridge so that I can then accurately reproduce it and then give you an accurate, show you an accurate effect on target. So if you have any information that could help, it doesn't matter if it's in English, French, German, whatever, you could leave a link in the comments whatsoever. I'm really having difficulty to find accurate information, so if you have it, please let me know. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and thank you, of course, for all your support, be it on Facebook, on YouTube, Instagram, whatever, and I shall see you very soon. Bye.